On its release in 1984, Skyfox certainly made a splash for Apple II owners, with its fast aerial combat and impressive 3D visuals. Blasting its way to success, it's no surprise to see it place high in the charts of the time, earning plenty of awards on the way. Not only that, but it would also see conversions to many of the other 8 and 16-bit computer systems available at the time. Its popularity would also make a follow-up inevitable, which happened in late 1987 with the release of Skyfox II, the Cygnus Conflict. Originally debuting on the Commodore 64, the following year it would receive conversions to the Atari ST, Commodore Amiga, and MS-DOS capable PCs. After the opening credits play out, you're taken to the game's main menu screen. Along with picking which of the game's missions you want to take on, you can also set your difficulty level and review the specs of the fancy Skyfox II warp fighter you'll be taking out into space. Unlike most other games of the time, all of the game's 10 missions are available from the outset. Now, this is framed as you partaking in simulations of hypothetical engagements with the Xenomorph fleet, now pushed back to their home system after the events of the original game. Now, it also happens to take away from the impact of it all, because you're just practicing hypothetical missions and not actually taking the fight to the Xenomorphs and winning. Before taking to the simulated stars, however, it's well worth reviewing each mission's description, as whilst they're all covered in the game's manual, I did happen to find some inconsistencies around the objectives of those missions. And that starts right from the very first mission. It's meant to be a fairly straightforward run, with you taking out Xenomorph fighters whilst following them back to their base and taking it out. The inconsistency between what's stated in the manual and what's shown in your briefing was enough to make me feel lost for quite some time. It can be a bit of a barrier for new players, especially those expecting Skyfox II to be more of a pick-up-and-play experience, like the first game. But moving away from the missions and onto the flight experience, and from a technical front, by the standards of 1987, especially with the original Commodore 64 version, the sensation of speed once you're in flight is seriously impressive. The sprite scaling is quite neat, but more importantly, it's fluid. While the original Skyfox was visually impressive by 1985 standards, what we have here a mere 2 years later moves far, far better. Obviously the result of being designed first and foremost to take full advantage of the Commodore 64's hardware features, instead of just being a mere translation from another machine. The same can be said of the 16-bit versions, though to a lesser extent. Though it may not be as visually jaw-dropping looking here on the Amiga compared to the C64 original, the visuals do work well in motion, offering detailed sprites and solid movement just like its 8-bit sibling. This, I feel ultimately, is a big part of what makes Skyfox II work. At least technically, of course. What also helps are the combat mechanics, particularly around the enemy Xenomorph AI. Though they don't pose much of a challenge when set to their easiest level, things do change as you raise the difficulty. Keeping lock on the Xenomorph fighters now involves plenty of twisting and turning to keep them right in the center of your gun sights, and they'll take many more hits to dispatch. No matter the challenge, watching a Xenomorph fighter or starbase explode in a fireball when defeated never stopped being a thrill for me. Which leads into the weapon systems. The Skyfox II Warp Fighter is armed with 3 of them. Neutron disruptors serve as your primary weapons, activated with a press of the fire button. The bolts launched will head right into the center of your screen, taking out whatever is in the way. You'll typically use these to take out Xenomorph fighters, but also the asteroids which you'll encounter as you voyage into deep space. Joining them are photon pulse bombs, activated by hitting space. These are designed to lock onto any target visible in your front view screen and deliver a load of damage on contact. They're the only weapon you have which can take out enemy starbases. While the neutron disruptors are limited by your ship's power supply, pulse bombs are limited, with the number you're given varying from mission to mission. Finally, there are the antimatter mines. Now, I never really found use for them during my time with the game. They're dropped out the back of your fighter and detonate after a short period of time, dishing out damage to any craft which enters range. Like with the pulse bombs, you've only got a limited supply of them, which will vary from mission to mission. Regardless of whether you find them useful or not, you can't say you're not without options for taking out xenomorphs when on a mission. Now, back to the missions themselves. I found these to be the part of Skyfox II which shows both its great ambitions, but also its great weaknesses. The ambition comes from the size of the mission area. While the original game was confined to just the surface of one planet, here you're given free reign across an entire star system. In theory, anyway. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got full freedom to move anywhere you need to during the course of a mission. Earlier ones tend to have your objective be close to where you start out, though things do get fun as you get to the later ones, as you'll typically need to travel the length of the star map in order to reach your objective in a reasonable amount of time, which leads you to two important factors. The first being the wormholes. There are a number of these located across the system and offer near instantaneous links between 2 points in space. Finding an entrance is the easy part. You can identify them on your radar as the small points. But how do you work out where they end up? Well, you're going to need to track that manually, whether on a notepad or perhaps with your phone, or anything modern really. What would be better is if you could take advantage of the map which shipped with the game. Yep, there's a map alright, and it'd be handy if not for one little thing. The horrendous blue-on-blue printing done for the sake of copy protection, and copy protection alone. This is most important with the second feature, docking at friendly starbases. You'll need to do this to repair any damage you accumulated during battle, or perhaps when you need to recharge your ship's power supply. Docking is a mostly straightforward process. Locate a friendly starbase, get close, slow to a crawl, and once you're within range, hit the D key to engage docking procedures. But that's not quite it. Now you'll need to dig up the map and identify which base you're docking with. I'd like to think once per session might have been enough to prove you're a legitimate owner, but no, you'll need to do it every single time you try to dock. This is a process which involves you looking at your copy of the map, shining a light over it to try and work out what you need to type in, because of course the blue-on-blue printing of the map is rather unreadable. It's something I found to be utterly infuriating, and a genuine waste of time when I was playing the game. Now, when I cover games here on Beyond the Scanlines, I try to play them in a way which is representative of the experience from back in the day, which usually means that unless a game is heavily bugged and needs patches or fixes to be playable, I try to enjoy the original experience, warts and all. But with Skyfox II, this made me waste so much of my time that I really had to question, was it worth dealing with it? And honestly, I'm not all that sure. Though it's not necessarily a game-breaking issue, it is the first of them which I had here. But it's just one which greatly reduced my desire to want to go back and play it some more once I finished playing it to grab footage for this video. It's not the only reason I felt that way though, and the next one is far more painful. The mission structure. As you flick through the manual and read the briefings there, the missions you'll play, all 10 of them, sound kind of exciting. They have a mixture of defensive operations, offensive strikes, escort missions, and plenty more. They really sound like a great setup for something to dive into, especially for an extended period of time. In reality, though, I found them repetitive. Incredibly repetitive. As they all ended up being a variant on the same formula. Launch from your base, take out as many fighters as possible, whilst heading to an enemy base, take it out, then clean up the stragglers to bring it to a close. Continuing on with this, when you choose to play one of the escort missions, the sprites of the craft you'll need to escort look exactly the same as the xenomorph enemy fighters. Exactly the same. Yes, this is likely a restriction related to the limited memory of the Commodore 64. But consider the 16-bit versions. The Amiga, Atari ST, and PC offer far more memory which could be used for graphics. And if we look at the Amiga version, the same problem with reusing the fighter sprites for craft you're escorting happens to apply here as well. It makes these escort missions tougher as once you enter battle, keeping track of which targets you're meant to attack versus those you need to protect can get real confusing. In a way, I can't help but feel it shows where the ambitions which Dynamix had were limited by choosing the Commodore 64 as the lead platform for Skyfox II. It's a decision made as a response to the sluggish launch of the Amiga, which stung Electronic Arts quite hard based on the effort they put into publicising their early releases on the platform, based on how important they saw it. This also included a couple of games from Dynamix, both their original release Arctic Fox alongside their conversion of the first Skyfox. As a result, there are a number of issues the game has from being designed around the limitations of the Commodore 64. And the first of those is the lack of feedback. When you're targeting craft, the only information the game gives you is which faction it belongs to. You don't get damage levels. You don't get an identifier knowing if it's a critical target. There's nothing available which helps you prioritize the situation. So, as the state of play changes during your mission, it can be a surprise to see it suddenly end, with no real reason as to why it did. When you review the debriefing, you might get a moderate failure and not really understand why, or have an idea of what you can do better the next time you try to tackle it. For the simpler missions you'll face, this isn't really much of an issue, as you could sit down and replay those and not take too long to get back into the action. It's a whole other story for the longer, more complex scenarios which involve far more flying in order to get to your objective. Repeating and failing those scenarios multiple times gets old real fast when you're not getting any information on how to beat them better the next time you try. And this was the point where Skyfox II stopped being fun for me to play, transforming itself into more of a chore. While the earlier missions were simple in nature, they ended up being nothing more than locating the enemies, following them to their base, and taking it out to win. In fact, that is the first two missions to a T. The only difference is, in the second mission, you're chasing missiles, and they're not immediately apparent on your radar, so it's very easy to miss them and fail the mission. Once again, without any clue that they were there. I did find some of the later ones offered some neat mechanics, like the one in which you need to sneak your way through to the enemy's home starbase and eavesdrop on their communications. This one truly relies on knowing how the wormhole network works in order to allow you to save your power supply whilst you've got your ship's cloaking device enabled. Then we have the final mission, the Boondock Expedition. From the briefing for this one, I thought it sounded rather neat. Your mission is to locate a lost starbase, but at the end of the day, it's nothing more than a glorified case of finding a tiny needle in an intergalactic haystack. The game gives you one clue, an approximate coordinate in one axis. So, you can kind of see where this is going, am I right? Cue the player endlessly flying. And flying. And yes, even flying some more, hoping to have something come up on the in-game radar. Yes, you could see just how much of a waste of time this mission was. I spent a good hour trying it out once and got nowhere. Which I think sums up Skyfox II for me. It's a game which offers an incredible step forward, at least by the standards of 1987 for the humble Commodore 64. But it's a game in which trying to push the boundaries as far as it does result in a cost, making the game somewhat challenging to play. The moment-to-moment space combat action is great, especially once you turn the difficulty up, as dogfighting the Xenomorph fleet can become quite thrilling and intense as a result. But with many of the game's missions following the same general pattern, along with the lack of information about objectives and mission progression, it ultimately becomes repetitive and draining and not all that much fun. The lack of information here is something which many games of the era managed to avoid. In fact, many of Microprose's simulations of the time were great at keeping the player informed as to what was happening during the course of each mission, even when trying to deal with the challenges of trying to make 3D visuals work on hardware like the Commodore 64. Perhaps had Skyfox 2's development been focused on 16-bit systems, maybe many of the restrictions which the game had leading to these design problems could have been relaxed. Potentially, we could have had a proto-Wing Commander on our hands, offering frantic combat in an intriguing universe. Sadly though, that isn't the case here, and what we're left with gives us plenty of questions on perhaps what could have been.